Okay,
Good.
this is Bob Baer. Hello, everybody. Welcome. And Dan has agreed to be my slide changer for me so that I can keep focused on the message that we're delivering and not have to multitask. So thank you for agreeing for that. So we'd like to take a few moments and reflect on the life of Hattie Hendrick Guyette. She is one of 8 children of Ellen McMahon Hendrick and John Hendrick, who are our common ancestors. Little is known about her, possibly because she died so many years ago. But in recognition of the 100-year anniversary of her death, which is today, we have researched her life and developed this documentary, as a tribute to her family, the whole Hendrick family, and the many who died during the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. We've invited some descendants of Hattie Guyette onto this call. Hope you are able to make it. We located these descendants through our DNA testing. Next slide. So let's start at the beginning. Hattie was born on the 3rd of July in 1885 in the small town of Factoryville, which is located in the northeast corner of Pennsylvania. This part of Pennsylvania is very scenic, especially when the leaves are changing color. It's known as the Endless Mountain Region. The I always stumble on this word. The Tancuna Creek runs through this very peaceful town. When
you did that better than I would have, Bob.
I had practiced it so much. It's Tunkanic.
There you go.
Anyways, maybe some of the locals would have another pronunciation for me too. When Hattie was born in 1885, the government didn't issue birth certificates. So we don't have one for Hattie or her siblings. Before the early 1800s, births were documented through baptism records. Rarely, an entry in an old family Bible might also provide proof of a birth date. But we haven't yet been able to locate a baptism record for Hattie. Assumably, she would have been baptized Catholic, but it appears there were no Catholic churches in Factoryville at that time. Most of the population there were Methodist. For Hattie, we've relied on other records to determine her date of birth, such as the 1900 census, cemetery records, and her death certificate. Next. Factoryville has been in existence since the early 1800s. Originally, they had a mill there where people could bring wool and have it woven into cloth. The wool factory, as it was called, didn't last very long. In fact, it hasn't existed for years. However, the name Factoryville stuck for the town. As is true for many towns of that era, a railroad line passed through it and brought business and people to the area. The tracks ran along what is now Route 11 and 6. By the time Hattie was born, the population had already grown to 600 residents and was large enough to support 2 hotels. One of these, the Depot Hotel, located next to the train depot, was managed by the Hendrick family and was where Hattie spent her very early days. 2 of her other siblings were also born in Factoryville. So let's take a closer look at this map. It shows how Factoryville looked in 1880, about 4 years before the arrival of the Hendricks. It is really interesting map. Looks like one you would find in an antique store in a small town somewhere. Next. This map had a key that lists points of interest, including the Depot Hotel, which is referred to as the Depot House. Next. Also, in the upper right-hand corner, you can actually see the Depot Hotel. This map was quite a find. Thank you, Dan. Dan's our map guy.
Upper left,
Next.
but yes, that's right.
Okay, next slide. This is the Hendrick. This is Hattie's family. Her parents are John and Ellen McMahon Hendrick. John, pictured here with his son George, who's my great-grandfather, was the very first Hendrick born in the United States. He lived on a farm near Dusshore, Pennsylvania. His parents were from Carlow, Ireland. Ellen McMahon, also pictured, was born and raised in Dusshore. She was also first generation. They say she was a redhead in her early days. She married a man named Brosnan, who died when Ellen was 2 months pregnant with their first child. It's an interesting story we'll get to one day. Ellen then married John Hendrick. And after the birth of George, their first child, they started their trek towards, ultimately, Rochester, New York. So let's discuss the siblings you see on this list. Hattie had a half-sister, and that was something I had to practice a few times too. Try saying that without tying up your tongue. Hattie had a half-sister named Joanna, who was also known as Jessie. She was a very interesting woman. She was born 7 months after her father's death. She was his sole heir, which would have ramifications for her later in life. She lived with the Hendrick family until she moved to Chicago as a young woman and started her adult life there. She married and divorced the same man twice before marrying a slightly younger man who brought a lot of stability to her life. She had one son with her first husband. Jessie remained close with her Hendrick family for most of her life. Next on the list is George W. Hendrick, my great-grandfather. He spent most of his life in Rochester. He worked as a chauffeur and had other occupations and hobbies, such as raising rabbits for the local hospital. Have you ever heard of the rabbit test for pregnancy? George's mother, Ellen, worked with a woman who would eventually become George's wife. Mary Ann Maiden was from Canada. They had 7 children. The next child was Ellen. That was her formal name. Friends and family called her Nellie. She married a man named Ed Rogers and had 2 children. When Ed died, their son, who had already moved to California and was working in Santa Monica, called his mom and sister to come to California and live there with him. They agreed. The Hendrick family had expanded into Southern California. The next born is Bob Hendrick. He was a paper boy in his youth and became a bar owner and later a hotel operator. I guess hotel operating is in the blood. He spent most of his years living within a stone's throw distance from his parents on Hudson Avenue until and even after their death. He and his wife had 9 children. Bob outlived all of his Hendrick siblings, dying in 1971 at the age of 88. The next born was Hattie, who this document is dedicated to. Formal name is Harriet. After Hattie came Elizabeth. She was known as Eliza. She was a beautiful woman who aspired to be an actress. She married Martin Burkett, known as Jim, but sadly died due to the miscarriage of her first child. She was only 20 years old. Her husband went many years before marrying again. Frank was the next born. He served in World War I, where he was wounded and gassed just days before Hattie died in Rochester. After the war, he took a job in Quincy, Mass, and died there as a single man, no known children. Then along came Mary, referred to as Molly, which is another nice Irish name. She was interested in joining the nunnery, but for some reason did not. She lived at home with her parents until her mother died in 1930. Brother Frank offered her a place to stay in Quincy with him, and so she moved there. But when he died, then she returned to Rochester and lived with her other brother, Bob Hendrick. Molly passed away in 1962 and is buried next to Frank at Holy Sepulchre. The last child born was the favorite, Edward. His nickname was Bucky, although I don't know why. He worked in construction and lived at the home on Hudson Avenue. I was told by his nephew, William Hendrick, that he would bring home things from the houses he was demolishing. It was not uncommon to see old sinks, toilets, and other treasures from these homes for sale on the front lawn of the family home on Hudson Avenue. Bucky died rather unexpectedly in 1930, coincidentally on the same day as his mother. He had no children. So most of the Hendrick family is buried in Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Rochester, except for two, Jesse and Nellie. We do not know where Jesse is buried. Another mystery. Next slide, please. Dan. Oh.
I'm still here. A little delay there.
Boring you. You were taking a little nap there.
Oh, not yet.
Okay, good. Okay, so John Hendrick and his young family made a series of moves across Pennsylvania and New York. We've identified this progression on this map. Before Hattie was born, the family lived in Dushore, which is number 1. And John was a farmer when they were living there. After the birth of George, the family moved to a small town called Orange, PA, where John worked as a butcher. Nellie was born in Wilkes-Barre, which is number 3 on the map, and Bob was born in Chinchilla, PA. We only know this because Bob told this to his children. Next, the family moved to Factoryville and stayed there from approximately 1884 until about 1889 or maybe 1890. This is where John worked as a hotel operator. What we know about their life in Factoryville, we know due to the great detective work of cousin Gail. Thank you, Gail. John stopped working in the hotel around 1888, and the family relocated to Bern, New York, sometime between 1890 and 1892. So you can see that's quite a distance from where they had been living. John continued the new tradition of working in the hotel industry. They lived in Burns, where Molly and Bucky were born. Ultimately, they relocated to Rochester. There are several theories as to why they moved to Rochester, but none have been proven yet. But we're working on it. Next slide. So Hattie and George were married on November 5th, 1902 in St. Bridget's Church in Rochester. That church is pictured here. The ceremony was performed by Father Thomas Hendrick. We do not know yet if this person is a relative of the Hendrick family. His name seems to come up a good bit, or just shared the same last name. We have already considered some possible connections and will continue to investigate that. Standing up for the couple were Frank Grondo, who appears to be a relative of George's mother, and Hattie's sister, Nellie Hendrick Rogers. Interestingly, Nellie and her husband were married in that same church by the same priest just a few years earlier. Here is an image of the church's wedding record. Looking at this more closely, next slide, oh, you got it. You will see this is written in Latin, and the last name had a typo that spell check did not detect. Next slide. Next slide. There we are. This detailed map highlights the various addresses that were significant to Hattie in the Rochester area. The first two addresses were the homes on Hudson Avenue where the family lived. Neither 234 Hudson nor 402 Hudson stand any longer. I've never seen pictures of these homes, but William Hendrick described the house at 402 Hudson to me. It was a two-story building with a central staircase. There are two rooms in the front of the house. One had a trap door that led to the basement. John's rocking chair sat on that trap door. William was young at the time, but he also remembered a woman living upstairs. We don't know if that was Molly or maybe even Nellie. Next slide. After Hattie married George Guyette, they lived at 64 Wooden Street. This building still stands. And then they later lived at 180 Monroe Avenue in Brighton, which we've not been able to locate on the map, which is interesting. Next slide. So in this slide, you'll see the only two homes that are still standing. 64 Wooden Street on your left appears to be a single family. Obviously, this is what it looks like today, thanks to Google Maps. Hattie and George would have moved there shortly after they were married. The other building is 180 Monroe Avenue. This is what these buildings look like today. Next slide. The Guyette family, Harriet, George, and the children. There is an interesting 6-year gap between the first and second child. Sometimes such a gap is seen when a child is born but dies young. This does not appear to be the case based on the 1910 census, where Hattie indicated she had 3 children and all 3 were living. Their first girl only lived 2 years, but the next 2 lived full lives. Those are shown on here with their married names. Marion married Pratt, and Ella married Kemp. The youngest child, Robert, died of the Spanish flu at age 18 months. Next slide, please. Next. Oh, good. Here are the only known pictures of Hattie. The first picture provides clues as to when it was taken. A photo detective could assess the hairstyle and clothing to determine the approximate year. I suspect this is what she looked like around the time of her marriage. This second picture is interesting too. Hattie is holding a baby. The baby is identified as the daughter of Nellie Hendrick Rogers. Remember Nellie? She was Hattie's bridesmaid. Nellie named her baby Harriet, possibly after the baby's aunt, Harriet Guyette. This provides even more hints as to the closeness of the Hendrick family. Harriet Rogers was born in 1898, the little girl. So this picture was probably taken around 1900. The last picture you see is an image of the back of the middle picture. It has handwriting of Nellie Rogers. She would record various pieces of information on the backs of pictures. Next slide, please. Okay, imagine the fall of 1819 in Rochester, 100 years ago today. World War I was raging. To win the war in Europe, involvement of American soldiers was critical. But there was a flu spreading rapidly across soldiers in the overcrowded boot camps. Those infected became quite ill with respiratory complications. Some died. Civilians were becoming concerned about a possible flu epidemic. However, the government was suggesting this was only an issue in the boot camps. But by late summer, it started to spread to the civilians. Rochester's local government outlawed uncovered coughing, spitting was forbidden, and handshaking was discouraged. Viruses had not been discovered, and the medical community assumed this was a bacteria that did not respond to routine treatment. Hospitals were overrun, and makeshift hospitals were being established in suitable buildings around town. The Red Cross was running full-page ads to recruit nurses to help treat people. Imagine what that was like, with the fear of not wanting to catch this, but the need for people to tend to the sick. In September, when infection was spreading logarithmically, as you can see from this graph that's on the screen, the flu was about to reach its peak, but people didn't know this. People like the Guyettes and Hendricks were both concerned about the war and fearful of the flu, as more flu-related deaths were reported each day in the Rochester newspapers. The flu would usually come on fast and strong. The youngest child of George and Hattie Hendrick Guyette, Robert Guyette, became ill and passed away on October 21st, 1918, at the age of 18 months. It's not known if his mother cared for him at home or took him to a hospital for treatment. His death record said he died in Brighton, New York, so perhaps he was at the Guyette home that we saw in that picture. The family most likely were grief-stricken. The other children, the other Guyette children, were old enough to understand the gravity of the situation. And Hattie must have been experiencing some symptoms of the flu herself during this time. The second tragedy hit the family on October 23rd, 100 years ago today, when Hattie died of the same illness that took her son just 2 days prior. The day before Robert's death, Hattie's brother Frank, serving in the war in France, was gassed and wounded on October 20th, 1918. He did survive. But imagine how much grief this was for the Hendrick and the Guyette families. Next slide, please. I have to minimize this. This is the only slide I was reading from the slide and not from my notes. So here we have a copy of Hattie's death certificate. And it's really hard to read, possibly because the writing is so small, or maybe because it's been photocopied a few times. But we see that the doctor had certified that he attended to Hattie from October 15th to the 23rd, and he last saw her on the 23rd, which is the day she died. He may have been taking care of others in the family too, like maybe Robert, the baby, or maybe other people in the family were sick from this too. Other people didn't always die from this flu. Some people would recover. But the certificate does not indicate if Hattie died at home, but says her death was in Brighton, New York, and that she died due to pneumonia and bronchitis associated with influenza. She was buried 2 days later, October 25th. Next slide, please. So what became of the Guyette family after Hattie's death? George, her husband, was listed in the 1920 census with his children and his father living at 184 Monroe Avenue. Interestingly, George's mother was still alive and living in Vermont with her other children. Did George's father come to live, or was he just visiting when the census counter came to visit? The last address, 215 Allen Street, was listed in the 1930 census as the family's address. This home is no longer standing as it was demolished to build the Interstate 490 Interloop Exchange just southwest of the Frontier Field in downtown Rochester. In 1930, Hattie's mom, Ellen Hendrick, passed away. Her will lists the Guyette children, the 4 surviving Guyette children specifically, leaving $25 to each of them. I imagine this was a decent amount of money considering the stock market crash just the year prior in 1929 and the beginning of the Great Depression. George never married after Hattie died. And when he died in 1931, he was also buried in Holy Sepulchre, but not near his son or his wife, since they were in single graves. If you visit the cemetery to pay your respects to Hattie, you will notice something very indicative of the year 1918 when you reach the row where Hattie is buried. The headstones in that row all show death dates that are very close together, another sign of how terrible the Spanish flu was. It was written there were so many deaths that they temporarily ran out of coffins. They also modified the way they made coffins so that they could minimize the use of wood. For Hattie and her son, Robert, there is no grave marker. I'd like to think there may have been wooden markers at one time, but if there were, there is no longer evidence of that. So from birth to death, this is the story of Hattie Hendrick Guyette. Next. So I had mentioned that we had invited some of the Guyette relatives onto here who may not have known very much about their ancestor Hattie. So I would ask them if they have any stories to share or any pictures they could share or any pictures of the Hendrick family at all. We would love to be included and to see some of these. We do hope to create more presentations like this one on our other ancestors, so stay tuned. Dan, over to you.
Great job, Bob. That was a lot. That was a lot to go over, but you handled it very well and in very good time, I might mention as well.
Yeah, 30 minutes, get everyone back to the World Series.
That's right. So just in summary, as Bob mentioned, we are looking to do this for other relatives. We are still interested in learning more about Hattie and the Guyettes. please pass on any information you may have. We'd be more than happy to compile it and use it for the next set of presentations. So thanks everyone for joining us. I wanted to give you the opportunity, if you had a question, feel free to raise your hand and I will unmute your line. And while I give you a moment to do that, if you'd like, I also wanted to mention that, if you're interested in joining our discussions, we do meet typically once a month on a Tuesday evening, 9 Eastern. So this is the same time we usually meet. We'll take a look at each other's schedules to determine which Tuesday in the month works best, but we try to stick to that monthly schedule. We do record the sessions for future reference, and similar to this webinar, you can join by phone or computer. And usually for those sessions, we have our webcams on as well, if you're able to do that. It's always nice to see some relatives, some familiar faces, so we like using the webcam. And more importantly, we can share screens. So, as more research comes through, it's an easy mechanism for us to share what we found. Gail in particular has been very good over the last few months in terms of uncovering new and exciting information. So we're always looking forward to hearing what Gail has brought to the table. I also wanted to mention that we do have a fourth person that started attending our sessions. Our cousin Patty, who actually lives in Dewshore, is a McMahon relative. So when you look at, we're all sort of descendants of Ellen and John. Well, she's descendant on Ellen's side, where we spent most of our time today talking about Hendricks. But what a wealth of information. It's great to have her there. She can really put some of our questions into context. It's a small community, and a lot of the buildings that we hear about are still standing. So it's really neat to hear her perspective on that as well. So I didn't see any raised hands for questions. So Bob or Gail, I just figured I would open it up to you if you had any other closing comments before we finish up.
Well, I do.
Hi, everybody. Go ahead, Bob.
Okay. While we were going through the presentation, our cousin Kurt Heider had sent me a text saying that he actually taught school in Factoryville. So we may be able to get some in-depth information from him one day.
Oh, that's great.
That's fantastic. Hi, everybody. This is Gail, and I just want to thank you, like Bob and Dan have done already, for joining us. And it's been a lot of fun for us. We started these meetings maybe almost 2 years ago now. And having this one night a week to get together and talk about our ancestors has really helped us learn more about them and helped us with our research. And it's been so much fun to get to know each other better. So we'd really encourage any of you to join us who'd like to, or if you don't have the time or interest to do that, you have our emails, and please email us. And if you'd like copies of any of these photos, we'd be glad to send you a digital copy as well.
Excellent point, Gail. Excellent point. And yeah, that's great. So as Bob mentioned, you never know what you're going to find. We've got Kurt, who's got some information, about Factoryville. It's always neat to hear a new perspective and some new stories, and maybe that'll shed some light on some of the mysteries we still have around our ancestors' time in that area. So with that, we will close up. I want to thank everyone again for joining us tonight, and we look forward to doing this again. And I hope everyone has a great night and a great fall 2018. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.